Hi, everybody. This is Ronelle Delmont again, and I have a great book. It's really an enormous book. It's like, how many? 500 pages, but you can't put it down. It's a mystery, a thriller, but not a happy one. JFK and the Unspeakable, why he died and why it matters. A very important question, even though it's been, let's see, 63 and 37 and 21 is 58 years. Yeah, unbelievable. We all remember where we were when we heard about the shooting. JFK and the Unspeakable, Why He Died and Why It Matters by James W. Douglas. And Douglas is spelled with two S's. This is one of the greatest book. It's considered by most people who question the JFK assassination, which is by now must be 90 something percent of all Americans. I don't know the number, but it's been very high from the very beginning. But this is considered the best book ever written. There are people who object to the religiosity of it because the author is he's a peace activist, but from the Catholic point of view, he's a free-thinking Catholic. I did a book review last time called Free Thinkers, and I explained what all of that meant to our country and the history of America. Well, this is a free-thinking book about the assassination, why Kennedy had to die. Why does it matter that he died? And what in the world is the unspeakable in the title? Well, James Douglas tells the story of how he got involved in this in the first place, because most people who write books like this are either lawyers, investigators, intelligence people from one end of the extreme to the other. I don't know how many books. I only have a few of them. I've been interested in the assassination all of my life, but I've only read a couple of books about it. I reviewed one called The Devil's Chessboard by David Talbot a couple of months ago. I did do a book review of that. That's one of my favorite books of all time because it's the story of Allen Dulles. This is the story of John F. Kennedy, and it's 500 pages that you cannot put down. So I'll tell you why. James Douglas explains that he came to be a researcher in this subject only because as a professor at Hawaii University back in the 60s or 70s, I forget, he's in his 80s nowadays, but maybe he's not 80 yet. He may be in his 70s. I'm not quite sure. He lives in Birmingham, Alabama. He's an activist today, and he's never been a lawyer, and he's never been a historian. Usually those are the people who write these kinds of books. But he got involved because he was teaching civil rights of some, I'm not sure what his topic, what his classes were about, but they were very much against this. Yeah, I guess it was the 60s and 70s because he was encouraging his students, college students, to protest the Vietnam War and to march for civil rights of Black people and Asian people. He was in Hawaii when he was doing this, and his students were getting arrested. They were getting arrested. They went to jail for 6 months, 2 years, whatever. And he began to feel like he better put his money where his mouth is. And he began to engage in civil rights activism and protests for the war and protest on behalf of civil rights of Black people, Asian people. And he was getting arrested. And later on, and of course, he went through what we all did with the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X followed Yeah, it was Malcolm X that came after. No, Malcolm X first. I'm losing my memory of which one came first, but certainly Robert Kennedy in the 70s came after his brother. He was the last one. And these four assassinations are the impetus for why James Douglas wrote this book and why he became an investigator and why he began to think about it in terms of his belief in Catholicism. He was a student of religion. I think he's never been a minister or a priest, I don't think, but he had a degree in divinity. And James Douglas began to look for a way to think about John F. Kennedy's murder, because that was the first of the four. What did it mean? Was it connected to the other three? All of these questions were asked by a monk living in Kentucky. He was part of a monastery. You've heard the name, I'm sure, Thomas Merton, Merton. He was a Trappist monk living in a small farmhouse. I think there's maybe a picture of it in the book. No, I looked this all up online. There are photographs of Merton's little house in some farmland of Kentucky where the monastery had their establishment, and no one was allowed to speak. This is a monastery. I forgot the word for it, but the monks were not allowed to speak. Of course, no television, no radio. So why did he pick on Thomas Merton? Thomas Merton, back in the 60s, when Kennedy was the president, and even before and afterward, Thomas Merton was repressed by the monastery to not, he was prohibited from publishing his articles, his essays, his opinions. He was the most outspoken religious voice of any religion against the Vietnam War, against something called the Unspeakable. And that's where the word was chosen by the author of this book. The word unspeakable was Thomas Merton's word for something that he saw. Now remember, Merton had no TV, no radio. The only thing he had were, for some reason, he was allowed to read newspapers, and he began a correspondence with everybody on earth that would listen to him, including Ethel Kennedy, John Kennedy's sister-in-law, Robert Kennedy's wife. And the topic he engaged them all in, because he never stopped, was to discuss the probability, because that's how he looked at it, the actual probability that forces in the background of every president were going to come forth and ignite the entire world to destruction. He only saw it that way for obvious reasons. Many people back then did see the hopelessness of having 60,000 nuclear weapons on this earth. The nuclear arms race was the unspeakable that he referred to. And that was now in the hands of a president who was a Catholic, the first Catholic president. And I should remind all of you that America had never had anything but a Protestant leader. Even though I explained in the last book review that Abraham Lincoln belonged to no church, he was definitely not an atheist, but Abraham Lincoln refused to belong to one church or another to show favoritism. He never did. And Americans would never have tolerated a Catholic for their president. As you may remember, Al Smith, the governor of New York, tried in the 20s to become president, and his adversaries warned voters nonstop. They reminded everyone in the country, if you vote for Al Smith, you're going to vote for the Pope. and the Pope in the Vatican will be running our country. And the fear of a Catholic president was very, very strong. So in Kennedy's case in 62, how could I forget? I was in high school, and it was a very big deal because Kennedy and Nixon went on television and they had the first debate. And you all remember that, I'm sure. Um, Kennedy's election was probably not kosher. Most likely, historians agree on this. This is not just my opinion because I honestly don't know what happened to finagle with the election, but it was tampered with for sure. Nixon should have been the president, but you know, I have to say this as a personal comment that I'm known for having said a million times to people, who cares who the president is? It doesn't matter because the security apparatus, the intelligence apparatus, the corporate state and Wall Street apparatus, they're all choosing what happens, and the president could be anybody. Well, I've said that a million times, and basically I do believe that. But when I read a book like this, JFK and the Unspeakable by James Douglas, I have to bite my tongue because it may not be true what I'm saying. It may be true now, but it certainly wasn't true in 1962. And you'll see why. It turns out that John F. Kennedy is, first of all, one of the things about this story that it focuses on JFK in the sense of his bravery, his courage, and his deep pain, physical pain, because he was a very sickly man. And during the war, the PT 109 story is graphically told in this book, as the author has gone into great detail, not in bullets, not in guns. There's nothing about Dealey Plaza and the very little, there's no forensic stuff in here about the bullet, you know, the single bullet that went through 3 people in different directions. And there's almost none of it because James Douglas has assumed that Kennedy was murdered by a nefarious conspiracy. What was the conspiracy about? Why did he have to die? Who did it? There's a much broader aspect to this book that's absolutely fascinating, and it deals with international relations between, of course, who? Who? Them and us. Who is them? You know who they are, the Soviets. We spent our lives, my entire life was spent well, not hiding under chairs. When I was a kid, I did that with a dog tag around my neck from the bomb that the Soviets were going to drop on me. But I spent my entire life thinking that they were the evil empire, we were the good guys, and that's the only way I saw things. So this book analyzes that aspect of why President Kennedy had to die and exposes things that are just too astonishing. And I'm going to tell you some of what they are. But Kennedy is now a very young president. He's not the youngest. I think Teddy Roosevelt was the youngest, but it doesn't matter. He was a war hero who saved, and I have to tell you this, if you don't remember the story, the PT 109 boat in the Pacific was blown up by the enemy, and he had the men, I think there were 10 or 11 of them that remained alive in the water. One of them was burned very, very badly and was unable to swim, unable to hold on to a log or a piece of wood like the other fellows were holding on and staying alive. One of them was so badly injured, there was no way he was going to live if John Kennedy had not taken the fellow's belt from his trousers, wrapped it around him in some way, and then stuck the belt buckle in his mouth and swam. Kennedy was a very good swimmer, and he suffered terribly from all kinds of, he was a sickly child, which I didn't know. His entire life was filled with pain, constant pain from, I don't remember what ailed him, but he was always suffering. Even to the day he died, he was in pain, always needing drugs and surgeries. But here he is in the water. They're all going to drown. They're all going to die, eaten by sharks or whatever. And they've got to swim something like, I think it was 30 miles to safety. And Kennedy had the belt of this dying man who couldn't save himself in his mouth and swam for half an hour and then stopped, half an hour and then stopped. And they got, everyone was saved because of the bravery of this future president. And Thomas Merton, let's get back to him, the monk in the monastery, the Trappist monk in Kentucky, living in a very small, probably a 1 or 2 room house on a farm, speaking to no one because it was against the rules of the religion, or the aspect of that Catholic group. He watched and listened, watched in the newspapers, and he read and he wrote, and he knew, like people who did pay attention back then knew about the arms race and how dangerous it was. And of course, everybody remember now, how would he not know about the Bay of Pigs? And then, of course, the standoff that went on for something like 11 days with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Why did the Soviets bring those missiles into Cuba? Well, because we invaded Guantanamo, and if America was going to continue to invade and push Castro out of power, the Soviets had to come and defend them. And so the missiles, nuclear missiles, were brought into Cuba, and the world stood breathless, waiting to see which bomb would go off first. Now, he explains in the book that there were people running the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all the military advisors to young President Kennedy. They looked at him as if he were a sissy. He wasn't a spy in World War II like Dulles and what's his name, Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan, and the OSS and the CIA. These guys looked down on President Kennedy because they saw him as a sissy. He refused to take their advice. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was being told just outright, they told him, you have to nuke Cuba. You have to be strong with the Soviets. You have to put them out of business. They were looking for war between the United States and the Soviet Union, which never happened at the end of World War II. These men in the CIA, I think I explained this in an earlier book review, they were disappointed at the end of World War II because we didn't go into Russia and end the Soviet Union. That's what they were banking on Hitler to do. Dulles and Donovan and all the rest of those guys in the OSS, many of them were so disappointed because they thought Hitler would be alive and Stalin would be dead, but the reverse happened. And they saw Kennedy as a sissy who didn't want to tangle with Castro enough. It's true, Kennedy was allowing them to try to kill Castro. He was. He signed off on a lot of these ventures where they were oh my God, there were so many. One was a cigar, an exploding cigar that was going to blow up in Castro's face. Another one was a scuba diving suit that was lined with poison, and Castro loved to scuba dive, and he would have been dead if he put that scuba diving suit on. A million different ways. The mafia was used, the agents of the CIA were being used to figure out how to do away with Castro. The invasion plot failed, and of course, James Douglas reiterates what David Talbot said in The Devil's Chessboard. that it was meant to entrap. The project of invading Guantanamo was meant to fail. It was meant to fail because they were hoping with the failure and the dying American Cubans lying on the beach of Guantanamo that Kennedy would finally get his military ideas. He was so unmilitary. The Kennedy would become angry, and to save these Cuban Americans lying on the beach dying, that he would send in the Marines, but he didn't. So by not doing that, by standing his ground, because he told them, I am not coming to save you if this mission fails. But they didn't believe the president. He was a sissy, but of course he would to save his political career, the president would have to send in the Marines. No, no, he didn't do that. And so he took full responsibility for Guantanamo. And then came the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that's the beginning of the unspeakable, the other part of the unspeakable. Because to Thomas Merton, who was putting out these essays and these letters, they were getting around, even though he was forbidden to have them published, people were listening to Thomas Merton speaking in a from a religious viewpoint. And that religious viewpoint was similar to the viewpoint of the people like Daniel Berrigan. What was his brother's name? The Berrigan brothers. They were Catholic priests. You may remember them. They went through army recruitment centers during the Vietnam War, pouring pig's blood all over the files so that the army could not recruit or draft young boys to go get blown up in Vietnam. This was an aggressive form of resistance to the war, and they were priests, and they were Catholic priests, the Berrigan brothers. You must remember them. They were great heroes of mine and everybody who was against the Vietnam War in the 60s. So the author of this book is treating the unspeakable as it is, how can I say, almost like a religious awakening that he received himself from the writings of Thomas Merton, who didn't watch television, but because he didn't, and because he didn't have a radio to listen to, he was not influenced by anything except what his mind, his free-thinking mind told him, which is the world is coming to an end. There's no way that Thomas Merton believed humanity was going to survive this era. And the reason he believed that it was based on reality, the reality of, they have 70 hydrogen bombs. Well, we got to have 700. Now they have 700 hydrogen bombs. That we have to have 7,000. By the end of the Cold War, we're still in a Cold War as far as I'm concerned. But by, what was it, 1989, 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed as a communist nation, there were 60,000 hydrogen thermonuclear bombs, 60,000, 60 with 3 zeros after it. And each one of those bombs needed an atomic bomb to ignite it. The atomic bomb invented in the 40s that was dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, that is the match to light a thermonuclear bomb. And there were 60,000 of them on Earth. Not all Russian and American, of course, because India, Pakistan, Israel, Germany, France, England, they all have, who am I leaving out? They all have their share of hydrogen, variety of nuclear weapons. But the Russians and the United States had the bulk of it all, 60,000 on this earth. And Thomas Merton saw the future, and it was, what do you call it when there's no, it was Armageddon, and he had no hope. But he kept following John Kennedy. And I'm going to let you hear and see the things that Kennedy said only 6 months before he was murdered, to have you understand why he was murdered. That is explained in this 500-page book. You could read this book, and I highly recommend it. It's really unbelievable because he ignores the bullets and the gun and the rifle. And yes, he talks about it, but not in a way that if you're not a scientist, you won't. It's not a scientific research that he's done with forensic. Uh, so everybody writes those books. This one is from an international relations point of view, which is why I love it. And it is considered the greatest book ever. It was 2004 or 2006. And it takes the story of the assassination, and not just John F. Kennedy's, but of course, as I started to tell you, he began getting arrested himself because he couldn't let his students back there in Hawaii go to jail by themselves, because he took up the commitment as well. In the case of Dr. King, and it was seen, and I'm going to explain, Martin Luther King's death came at a time after he gave a great speech at Riverside Church in New York City. And why was that a great speech? Because he went from civil rights activism in that speech. He never gave up on activism for civil rights, and that's what he's known for. Most people think of Dr. King as a civil rights leader and the greatest voice of that movement. But they forget, or maybe they don't remember, that he suddenly at Riverside Church, right before he died, gave a speech against the Vietnam War. And that's the stuff you don't go near. That's the stuff you don't touch. You don't touch military powers. You don't touch intelligence agencies in our country. You don't go near that. That's too lucrative. It's connected to Wall Street, as President Eisenhower warned us. When President Eisenhower went out of office in 1960, turning the 60, 52 to sit right, he turned over the White House to President Kennedy, not to his Vice President Nixon, who actually probably won that election. So Kennedy was inheriting the knowledge that Eisenhower was warning the country about in his farewell speech. And this is what he said in the camera. You could watch that on YouTube if you look for it. The greatest danger to our country's future, he said, was the combination of the military-industrial complex. In other words, what he's saying is, when industry, meaning the Wall Street industry, which is big business, when industry connects itself to the powers of the military, we're never going to be out of war. This is the danger that I'm explaining it in my own way, but he called it the military-industrial complex. And Kennedy comes into office never having known that there was a missile gap between the Russians and us, except he never knew, because why would he be told? The missile gap was the other way. We were the ones who had thousands of nuclear weapons, and the Russians had a few hundred, or maybe they had 40 and we had 4,000, some great imbalance like that. So we were the danger, not the Russians so much. We had all the power. And when Kennedy learned all of this by being in the White House, and he would ask the planners of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, there are 12 members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You and I don't vote for these people. We have no idea how they get in or out. They're appointed somehow, and some of them were horrific warmongers who would later, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, actually tell President Kennedy to nuke Cuba. You want to solve this standoff? Well, just drop a bomb on them. Now, I have to bite my tongue because I've been known to say it doesn't matter who the president is. And I started to tell you that. But the truth is, in this case, it mattered very, very much. I don't want to think what would have happened if Nixon had been in the White House instead of John Kennedy, because he stood up to these men who were older and wiser. Supposedly, they were more powerful during the war than he was, and he stood up to them, ignored their advice. And what happened next was a covert operation that the president conducted with only his closest friends and his closest relatives, a covert operation between himself and Nikita Khrushchev, himself and Fidel Castro, in trying to make a deal. Isn't that what Donald Trump was supposed to be good at? Deal making? Well, this is the ultimate deal of all. Secret negotiations going on between Nikita Khrushchev. They had to hide everything from their advisors. Why? Because Nikita Khrushchev had the same problem John F. Kennedy had. He's got a problem with the Joint Chiefs and the Pentagon, Wall Street, not so much Wall Street, but the people who generate money, like the bomb industry and the military industry, like Eisenhower warned us about. Well, you think Nikita Khrushchev didn't have the same problem? He sure did. He had to be very, very careful not to let anybody in his own cabinet, in his own Duma, in his own parliament, ever know what he's doing with the president of the United States, the two greatest enemies on this earth. If this is not a religious, spiritual awakening for people, I mean, the author is writing this because of the religiosity he feels about the morality and the morality. He's alluding to Thomas Merton's ability to understand the nature of God, because that's how they're attributing this courage that Kennedy comes up with. Where he got it from, who can say? I'm not religious, so I don't know, but the author of this book is, and Thomas Merton was a devout believer in God. And Merton worried himself practically to death. Oh, and he does die early. It's a very mysterious death, actually. He's in Europe when it happens later. But that's aside from the point. Merton called the unspeakable the first strike. And this was an issue that people spoke of every day in the newspaper, the first strike. There were people in the Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs who actually believed that there could be something called nuclear war between the Soviets and ourselves, and there would be a winner. Now, today, I think everybody understands there's no winner. First strike is important because it means you have the upper hand. Are you going to survive? I don't see how. And in these days, let's remember, in the 60s, nobody knew about nuclear winter. Nuclear winter came up in the 80s when scientists discovered that if a hydrogen bomb were detonated, or even atomic bombs, I'm not sure what strength, but the debris that goes up into the atmosphere can block out the sun for a very long time, which means nothing grows on the earth. This is what happened to dinosaurs 60 million, was it 60 million? 60 million, 65 million years ago. The dinosaurs who had been here for 200 million years. They owned this planet the way we do now. But the dinosaurs had nothing they could protect themselves from when a comet hit the earth and the debris went up in the air, and they all perished because they had nothing to eat. They starved to death. If they didn't burn up, they starved to death, and they went out of business. There's no dinosaur ever from 65 million years ago, and that's what's going to happen to us. Nuclear winter is what it's called. And it was not known in the 1960s. So the Pentagon and the military, they believed they could have first strike, the upper hand. And that scared John F. Kennedy. So I'm going to play for you a couple of clips from YouTube, but I want you to understand that what he's saying here is that from a religious point of view, by a brilliant author, a brilliant mind like Thomas Merton, who was scared. He wrote to Ethel Kennedy, he wrote to anybody who would listen to him that we need to stop this arms race, and we need to think of humanity as human and not the enemy, and we've got to make peace on this earth. And there was no more fervent voice than Thomas Merton's. In the midst of all the activity going on with the kids and the colleges and the protests. And the other thing is that Kennedy, most people don't know this, and that's why the book is so surprising to a lot of people. They think Kennedy started the Vietnam War, and in a way he did. He bought in to all of this stuff until he realized the warmongering of those who were advising him. He saw no purpose in all of this, and especially after the missile crisis, he changed his mind. He did a turnaround, and James Douglas refers to it in a Hebrew word, tshuva, teshuvah. I know that word because Bal Tshuva, the phrase Bal Tshuva in Hebrew is a person, a Jewish person who's never been religious, who turns around and returns to the religion and becomes very orthodox. The Bal Tshuva is a returning person or a turnaround. And James Douglas uses this Hebrew word, tshuva, to refer to John F. Kennedy. The Kennedy is remarkable in the sense of his tshuva, his return or his turnaround, his, I guess it's 180 degrees or 180 degree turnaround from a warmongering politician who knew nothing when he argued against Nixon in the debates that you're not tough enough on the Russians. Kennedy sounded like a tough cookie because that's the way you get votes. That's the way you get people to vote for you. You scare them to death that they're hiding under chairs like I did as a kid. We were told to hide under a desk from the hydrogen bomb. And you're scaring the public so that they'll look to you as for strength and protection. And Kennedy did that on his campaign, but he did not know. He couldn't have known what Eisenhower knew from the U-2 flyovers. What was that guy? Powers, the guy who was shot out of the air by the Soviets. Forget his first name. I'm forgetting a lot of things, but I got the gist of the book, so I hope you understand what I'm saying. The Kennedy had no idea that the Russians had 40 nuclear bombs and we had 4,000. He thought it was the other way around. And Eisenhower could never reveal the truth, because to reveal his knowledge that we were far, far ahead of the Soviets would be to admit that we were conducting secret flyovers with the U-2 planes. Gary Francis Powers, that was his name. And so when Kennedy gets into office, he discovers all of this and realizes the danger to humanity. And he was, I don't know how religious John F. Kennedy was as a Catholic, but Thomas Merton picked up on all of this danger, and it's very well expressed throughout the book. And so when Kennedy got scared enough from the Bay of Pigs, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis. He and Khrushchev and Castro were conducting secret uh, secret negotiations, helped by only their very closest trustworthy friends, to try to eliminate the missiles, the nuclear missiles. And that's what they were embarking upon when John F. Kennedy was murdered. So the author of this book, having no idea what he was getting into, having started off with the King assassination, Malcolm X assassination, of course, Kennedy's and Robert Kennedy's, these four assassinations are without any question linked. They're a chain of events that have much to do with one another. As I explained, as he explains, Dr. King's address at Riverside Church changed from just the civil rights topic to the civil rights and anti-war. Once Dr. King went on the anti-war, anti-Vietnam trail, protesting the war, that he could not go on living. He was too powerful. And on top of it, Malcolm X, who disagreed like 180 degrees with Dr. King. Malcolm X was very aggressive in his political viewpoints. And one of the greatest speeches, I should play it actually. I should have, I forgot to look for it, but I have listened to it many times. And if you can find it, Malcolm X's speech, right the day before his, the week that he's murdered, and the day after his house in the borough of Queens was firebombed, he appears in Chicago and he makes a speech without reading from a piece of paper. It's one of the greatest speeches I ever heard in my life. It's a remarkable speech, and he was a genius. And they were both, Malcolm X and Dr. King, were suddenly seeing eye to eye, sort of, and they were going to collaborate on the anti-war movement because, let's face it, Black people were dying in huge numbers in that awful war, and they could not remain alive. And neither could the president. The president could not have remained alive once he was known. And I'm going to show you in a few minutes. Well, I'll put it on now. First, I'm going to show you the author of this book, James Douglas, who's giving a very lengthy talk. I don't remember where it is, but it doesn't matter. I'll give you some idea of where he's coming from, what he looks like, what he sounds like, and some of his thoughts about Thomas Merton and John F. Kennedy. Okay, so in order to do this, I have to share the screen. Yes, share the screen, share the sound, and let's see what I can find in this. There we go. I think we're in business. Just one more minute.
I want to try to sum up as shortly as possible what the story is all about. And this is the way it goes. It's a story that I've tried to tell chronologically and point by point through a sea of witnesses, or a lot of witnesses. And in brief, that story is, on our behalf, he was President of the United States, so on our behalf, at the height of the Cold War, John F. Kennedy risked committing the greatest crime in history, starting a nuclear war. Before we knew it, he turned toward peace with the enemy who almost committed that crime with him. For turning to peace with his enemy and ours, Kennedy was murdered by a power we cannot easily describe. Its unspeakable reality can be traced, suggested, recognized, and pondered. That is one purpose of this book. The other is to describe Kennedy's turning. And then the hope is that by following the story of JFK's encounter with the unspeakable, we will be willing to encounter it too. There are a series of turning points. The first key one is the Bay of Pigs, but I want to concentrate on the most critical one, in fact, the most critical point in history, which is the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we almost went to a total nuclear war. And this is the climactic moment. At the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Nikita Khrushchev said something totally unexpected to his foreign minister, Andrei Gromyko. He said, "We have to let Kennedy know that we want to help him." As Khrushchev's son, Sergei, describes that surprising moment, his father hesitated to use the word help in response to John Kennedy's plea for precisely that. When Khrushchev did say the word aloud, it forced him to ask himself, did he really want to help his enemy, Kennedy? Yet Khrushchev knew from his secret correspondence with the US president that had been going on for a year, smuggling letters back and forth, that the two men agreed in their correspondence on Noah's Ark as a crucial symbol of their common predicament in the nuclear age. The precarious boat in which they and all of humanity were living on a sea of conflict had to stay afloat. After a short silence inspired by the sense of his word help, Khrushchev repeated it to a wondering Gromyko. Yes, help. We now have a common cause to save the world from those pushing us toward war. In that grace-filled moment, Nikita Khrushchev, his new partner, John Kennedy, and the world with them, went from darkness to dawn. What especially moved Khrushchev to help Kennedy by withdrawing the Soviet missiles from Cuba was Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynyn's description of his meeting with Robert Kennedy, our brother who died 40 years ago today. The president's brother was exhausted. Dobrynyn could see from Robert Kennedy's eyes that he hadn't slept for days. RFK told him the president, quote, didn't know how to resolve the situation. The military is putting great pressure on him, insisting on military actions against Cuba, and the president is in a very difficult position. Even if he doesn't want or desire a war, something irreversible could occur against his will. That is why the president is asking for help to solve this problem. In his memoirs, Khrushchev repeated a further chilling sentence from Robert Kennedy's appeal to Dobrynyn. He said, if the situation continues much longer, the president is not sure that the military will not overthrow him and seize power. Sergei has described his father's thoughts when he read Dobrynyn's report relaying the Kennedys' plea. The president was calling for help. That was how father interpreted Robert Kennedy's talk with our ambassador. The tone of the conversation was evidence of the fact that too delay could be fatal. The temperature in the Washington boiler had apparently reached a dangerous point and was about to explode. Half a world apart in radical ideological conflict, both Kennedy in his call for help and Khrushchev in his response had recognized their interdependence with each other and the world. they suddenly joined hands. After threatening to destroy the world, the two enemies turned to each other in desperation and grace. Instead of annihilation, they chose, in Khrushchev's words, a common cause to save the world from those pushing us towards war. Khrushchev's decision to help Kennedy in the missile crisis was reciprocated by Kennedy's helping Khrushchev by the American University Address, which was June 10, 1963. That address is to John Kennedy's assassination, as Martin Luther King's April 4, 67 address at Riverside Church is to his assassination. It's the why. In the American University, Kennedy, in effect, called for an end to the Cold War. He reached out to his enemy, Nikita Khrushchev. He said, I will not test a nuclear weapon again unless somebody else does. And he said, I want a nuclear test ban. And Khrushchev and he signed it within 6 weeks of that event. Khrushchev said it was the greatest speech an American president had given since Roosevelt. Both men, both John Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, were ready for more and more cooperation. Neither of them wanted the Cold War to continue. The deepening Kennedy-Khrushchev détente was the larger context of the unfolding plot to assassinate Kennedy. It had become clear to America's power brokers that the president of their national security state was struggling with his communist opponent, not so much over who would win the Cold War as on how to end it. From a national security standpoint, the president had become a traitor.
Okay, so stop share. I think you got the point of that little speech that the author of this book, Jim Douglas, is trying to explain the essence of why he wrote it. He's not a historian, but I'm going to show you that speech from American University. Just a clip of it. It's a few minutes. Somebody put it together. It's very long, and it's a very beautiful speech. You can find it on your own. Just put in American University, Kennedy. It's June 10th, 1963. In 6 months, he'll be dead. So let's see, share sound. And here we go.
What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears. But we have no more urgent task. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
So That's a very short clip. Oh, sorry. Oh, there it is again. There it is.
I graduated from American University in June of 1963. It was a very tense year.
It came on the heels of the Cuba Missile Crisis.
You know, we grew up being afraid of a nuclear bomb.
There might not be any grown-ups around when the bomb explodes. Then you're on your own.
You just knew that every Russian was bad, and they wanted to destroy the world. There was no talk. If they hit us, we were going to hit them, and bango.
The communist world was demonstrating its collective image of belligerence, power, and solidarity.
President Kennedy brought in a whole new view of things.
He was adored. He was loved around the world. He'd already delivered that incredible inaugural address.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
His call upon us as citizens to step forward, to be engaged, to look outward, began to create an excitement.
He chose American University because American University had already developed a reputation for public service, for reaching out across the United States and across the world for students and faculty.
So it was very, very exciting that he was going to speak at the graduation, at my graduation.
Every graduate of this school who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace should begin by looking inward, by examining his own attitude towards the possibilities of peace. Too many think it is unreal, but that is a dangerous, defeatist belief.
What I remember was that it was an extremely important speech.
This is Marvin Kell, Moscow correspondent, CBS News, Vienna.
In my judgment, even looking back upon it now, I think it's the best speech he ever gave.
We've never fought a war between the United States and the Soviet Union, and he held out an olive branch.
It was really out of step with the times. We were in a very martial attitude towards the Soviet Union. We'd just come out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And here was a president saying we should focus on peace, not victory, and coexistence, and respect.
And second, let us re-examine our attitude towards the Soviet Union. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue.
In those days, the word of a president of the United States was big stuff, and it was regarded as a big deal not only in the U.S. but all over the world.
It's remarkable. At the height of the Cold War, President Kennedy's speech was translated and broadcast almost in its entirety in Russian, the Soviet Union.
We really were talking to the Russians.
And certainly no one was expecting the blockbuster announcement that came.
I now declare that the United States does not propose to conduct nuclear tests in the atmosphere so long as other states do not do so.
The speech represented Kennedy's way of taking the world beyond the Cuban Missile Crisis into a new era.
And the way to do it was parley, find a way to compromise.
The president said, this country will not be the first to resume nuclear testing. He said such a declaration is no substitute for a formal binding treaty, but he said, I hope it will help us achieve one. This is Roger Mudd in Washington.
The speech was June of '63, the treaty was August, and he said it was his greatest accomplishment.
I think the big takeaway from the Kennedy speech is about the engagement with adversaries, not only to get to a place of better security, but better understanding.
President Kennedy was trying to look beyond antagonistic speech, trying to show the importance of judgment, the importance of taking the other into account.
He caused all of us to think differently, think more inclusively.
No, I think I was very, very directly inspired by that speech.
It was a moment of arrival for the university, a point at which the university's reputation was on the rise.
I will find myself lecturing either in India or Brazil or Australia, and American University, the speech.
At this point, where the university is with the programs to bring the awareness of the global community to our students and to involve.
Okay, so you get the point of that. I didn't plan on showing it, but I've seen it many times. this speech was very important, and only until Jim Douglas wrote this book, the people you just saw in that little clip are not saying that Kennedy was murdered because of that speech. Jim Douglas is saying that. I believe he's correct. Lots of people believe he's correct, that that's the reason the CIA, together with the mafiosi and the help of the FBI, perhaps, who knows, murdered our dear president, who was trying to spare the world from the dangers. Now, we have never used the nuclear weapons, but right now there are 20,000 of them left from the 60,000 at the end of the Cold War. But we're in another Cold War right now, so who knows what anybody's in charge of anymore. I hope I didn't scare you too much, but go play Mahjong. That's all I have to say. Enjoy your life, get your shots, and enjoy. So I'm going to talk about Sybil next time, the book called Sybil, the lady who had 17 different personalities inside of her brain. Yeah, Sybil Exposed is the next book. So we'll see you then. Take care, everybody. Goodbye.